Gender expectations in society, the evolution of the ideal body. During the 1910s, a fashion trend that swept the nation was known as the Gibson Girl. The Gibson Girl was inspired by illustrations from Charles Dana Gibson. The Gibson Girl focused on the buttocks and bosom area of women through the usage of a corset, which was wrapped around the rib cage. The fashion trend that swept the nation during the 1920s was known as the flapper girl. It was known to have daring hemlines that were in fashion during this time. This only picked up as time progressed, as we will see later. Stars of the silent screen, such as Olive Thomas and Elise Joyce, defined the flapper look. Whereas the 1910s and 20s steered away from the curvy look, the 1930s welcomed it during the fashion trend known as the sex siren. In other words, the sex siren focused positively on the curved woman. During the 1940s, we saw a fashion trend sweep the nation known as the Scream Queen, which incorporated a much more feminine appearance in the dresses that were sold around this time. The Scream Queen was really incorporated to welcome home the heroes returning from war. It was seen as a love icon of sorts. Much like the 1930s and unlike the 1940s, the 1950s trend that swept the nation, the fashion trend, was called the curves. As you would think, it emphasized very heavily on the curves. The motto during this time was known as bigger is better. As weight gain tablets hit shelves, Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor were the sex symbols during this time. Unlike the decade of the 1950s, the 1960s revolved around a more petite fashion. It was a return to the 1940s look, some may say. The swinging 60s, as many called it, saw the introduction of the miniskirt and a much slimmer figure. Supermodels Twiggy and Jean Shrimpton popularized the look. During the 1970s, a fashion trend that quickly swept the nation was known as the 70s pinup. The 70s pinup focused more heavily on the wider shoulders of women and the thinner hips as well. As we approach our current decade, we see that during the 1980s, the fashion trends that swept the nation emphasized more on the tall and athletic build of women. A motto during this time was that legs, they go on for days. In time, the 80s was known as the decade of the supermodel. During the 1990s, we see two fashion trends, a public fashion and a more business trend. The public fashion saw a more grunge look hit the mainstream, and a thin, more androgynous look hit the catwalks. However, polar opposite fashion, as some may say, which hit the business aspect of everyday life, was a more masculine appearance, which had focus on broader shoulders. The 2000s saw a trend known as the tone, which was far more revealing than any of the trends previous to this. Celebrities, much like Christina Aguilera and Britney Spears, located below, had their abs visibly showing and were known to use spray tans